Alberto Prieto has studied history, economy, politics. He focused on Latin America. He has written many books about economic integration, socialism, history, and leading figures like Fidel Castro. He received us at his house to talk about the many challenges Latin America faces now. Professors, thank you so much for giving this interview to Telesur. And it will be, I'm sure, tremendously interesting because when you see all the events that are going on in Latin America right now, there's so much to talk about. And essentially, a lot of questions that emerge from history and the origins of how the political processes have been evolving in the last 50, 100 years. And I wanted to start by provoking you in a specific issue. We saw a lot of leftist governments emerged in Latin America in a specific moment in our history, and in big, let's say, the wealthiest countries in our region. Nevertheless, now we're seeing how those leftist governments are losing power or influence over several countries in our region. Just recently in Chile, Sebastián Piñera won again to be the president. In Argentina, Mauricio Macri. In Brazil, Michel Temer, although he was not elected, he's the president of Brazil. And that's been going on up to the north of our region, with exceptions, of course, of Evo Morales in Bolivia, Tabaré Vázquez in Uruguay, and of course Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. Why do you think is this happening? Can we see this as part of a cycle? Or so if it is, can we expect again another leftist movement coming up, or at least gaining more power like it happened before?
Well, in the first place, let me tell you that's my pleasure to be here with you. Now, in relation with what you said, I will tell you that history is a complex process that never happens that a victory is won once and forever. We thought that the Russian Revolution was that way, and it didn't happen. And we celebrate the 14th of July because of the French Revolution. But the French Revolution was defeated in Waterloo, and then other processes had to take place. In Latin America, it has happened over the years in many processes. The independence revolution was basically, not totally, but was basically a liberal revolution. And then after the revolution, almost in all places, liberals lost power. And they had to start all over the process in order to make what is called the liberal revolutions that won in the second half of the 19th century. So that's something that happens constantly. Now, in Latin America, after the Russian Revolution, there were many forces that thought about socialism. The strongest one, because it was the best organized, were the communists, but they were not the only ones. And in the first half of the 20th century, nobody took power in Latin America under the banners of socialism. It was Fidel Castro, with his geniality, that opened the road for socialism in a very imaginative way that nobody have thought of. That's why he won.
Creative.
Creative, very creative. Now, afterwards, when the armed struggle started after the Cuban Revolution, well, it seemed for a while that everywhere was going to take place armed struggle and that it was going to win everywhere. Well, they won in Nicaragua in 1979. In other places, that didn't happen. It could have happened. But the victory of any political movement, and above all a revolution, that's the most complicated process because it's changing society. It's not continuing the old society, is very complex. And it is related with the unity and with the strength that these forces may have had. If I go to the political process, it's similar. It's uniting forces, getting enough strength. If you go to Brazil, Dilma Rousseff was elected president, but she was a minor force in Congress. She had aligned herself with other forces, in this case bourgeois, that became traitors to her presidency. But that can happen because it's in the way of doing things. That also happened before with Fernando Lugo in Paraguay, because when you align yourself with other forces, it depends on how you can manage all this process. Allende won with the biggest minority in 1970. And when he couldn't be ousted by the Congress, because his biggest minority was had enough strength not to be overpowered, well, they went to the army. And there was Pinochet and so forth. Now, that has happened again and again in Evo Morales in Bolivia. He hasn't been ousted, nor by one way, nor by the other. Or in Uruguay, with the Frente Amplio. And in Bolivia, and in the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, well, there has been a continuity, in spite that Hugo Chavez died. There, it's always said, is the union of the civilians and the military, because fortunately, Chavez knew how to manage the relationships in the army, and he made a Bolivarian army out of the old army, which hasn't given any doubt of their fidelity, in spite that in a moment when they betrayed Chavez for a few hours, there was some officers that did it, but the army as a whole backed up the process. So now we are in the middle of that. And you just said that about Sebastián Piñera. Was it inevitable that Sebastián Piñera won the presidency? Far from it. If you added up all the votes of the left, he would have lost. But the left quarrels between itself. They are more preoccupied by saying to the other one that he's this and that by the dangers of the right. And so they went even to the second round of elections. They didn't go united there. How could you expect to win under those circumstances? What image do you give to the people that are supposed to back you up in a political process? When some spectacular leader like Fidel Castro comes, well, then it happens. Because if you take the Cuban Revolution, it seems that it was very easy to do so.
Was easy?
By no means it was easy. When you see the people that Fidel put together in the process of the revolution, many had been enemies for decades. And his master of the art of policy got them together. But you can't create artificially the ability to convince people or to conduct people in a certain way. Many times we have the image that it can be done and then it doesn't happen.
You've been talking about leaders and the importance of leadership.
Yeah.
And that creates a lot of worry sometimes when you think about Latin America. Yeah. Some people, because they believe leaders, strong leaders, essentially in the Western media, they're depicted as populist leaders who want to stay in power forever, essentially when you read the American media about the Latin American leaders. And in other cases, they're seen as saviors, as gods in our region. And unfortunately, in these last 10 years, we're seeing historical leaders disappearing. Although their ideas are there, their presence was quite important, and they're not around anymore. Do you think, although new leaders like Rafael Correa emerged, like Nicolás Maduro, but do you think it's possible to survive, that those revolutions will be able to survive the human beings that created them?
Well, Venezuela is an example that can happen, because at an early age of life, Hugo Chavez, because of an unexpected sickness, he died. And he died at a crucial moment, in spite of what the process has gone up. And I would say that in the last month, after they created this possibility of the new constitution, assembly, and so forth, they gave a complete change to the political panorama in the country. They managed to do that. But that you have to be creative. Where was it written that they had to do that and that movement would be successful? Well, it wasn't written down. They thought of it. And it was successful. Evidently, it was successful. All the guarimbas, all that has disappeared. And they have a legitimacy today that was far from being attained 6 months or 8 months ago. So that's politics. You just can't follow the footsteps of the other, because the other one did that, I will do the same. You're in a different context, with different psychologies, with different traditions. For instance, Correa. Remember, many friends of mine said, oh, Correa has 1.5 million persons of signatures saying that they want him to go on being as president. And he said, well, it's not in the tradition of this country. In the tradition of this country is for a president to follow himself one term and not anymore. And I believe that on the Ecuadorian conditions, he was right, because he understood the traditions or the desires of the population. Now, these traditions are not the same all over, And the importance of the leaders is to be able to unite different currents that form the left, which are varied, to be creative, not to follow automatically the steps of someone, and then to understand the needs of the people. Because what will happen will have a certain relation with the wants, with the needs, with the desire of the population. Now, the population is very diverse, because if we're talking about votes, it's not the conviction of the soldier in the battlefield, because the vote of he who has a strong conviction and he who doesn't have it are the same value in the vote. So you have to add people in a very special context of different classes, of different groups, with different desires that many times contradict one of the other. And that's the ability of the politician to put all that together in a great movement towards the victory.
When you give your lessons, your classes about Latin American history, how much is Fidel Castro on it? Why is he there? Is it important to understand the present of Latin America?
There are men whose capability change the relation of strength. If you take the independence war, there were brawls constantly among the small or medium-sized leaders. Came Bolivar, and he had the ability to put them all together. And when he died, everything went back because it was his personal ability to do so. Fidel Castro said at the University of Concepcion in 1970 that the revolution is the art, the political art of getting together the biggest amount of people in a population to fight against the imperialists and their allies inside the country. Now, how could you define that? It's an abstract concept which was extraordinary, but you have to put it in each place because not the classes and the groups of classes, they don't act, they don't behave the same way in one country that in the other. So Fidel gave this solution in a concept that's brilliant, but you have to understand that in the context of each country. So that's why he'll be eternal, because you can't deny what he said. Because people talk about socialism, but the capitalist system has roots inside the country and has allies outside the country. Whether the allies of those who want to change the society outside the country have much less strength than the imperialists and their friends. So the art of revolution is to be able to put in the field of progress all these people that want to destroy the imperialists and their allies inside. Now, what happened in Chile? Why did the new left forces didn't get along with the old left forces? And why? No, you are too, you're not advanced enough, or you are not, well, you have to find the way. The way Fidel Castro did it was to do it gradually, because you can't go from 0 to 100 in one jump. There are some who want to do it, but history has proved that it can't be done. And if you do it, you lose power.
We're seeing a political dynamic very complex, with a particularity of having a war like Colombia.
Yes.
Where a big, after years of dialogue, finally they reached an agreement. But we see every day news that reports on how fragile is this process, how uncertain is that so wanted peace for the longest war in our continent. What do you think about that? Do you think it's possible to have peace in the current conditions of Colombia?
Colombia is a very complex country because of its different regions, its different origins, and so forth. If you take Colombian history in the 19th century, it's an enormous civil war constantly. Not exactly like this one, but it was continuous. Locally, then general, then local again, so forth. After Gaitan, the populist leader that was murdered in 48, there was a popular upheaval, insurrection, the Bogotazo, and a 10-year national civil war took place. From that time on, war has never stopped taking place in Colombia, with the difference that constantly it becomes more complex. Because when the violence in Colombia, that's how it's called, the 10-year war from 48 to 58, the violent years. There were no narcotraffic, there was no autodefensas, and so forth. Now, you have in Colombia that in the 60s, in the 70s, and so forth, this civil war that was reborn because there had been a truce, an armed truce. But When the truce was over, the civil war started again in 63, 64. But then gradually other problems came. Now, the government, and you must not forget that Santos was Uribe's Minister of Defense or of War, or whatever you want to call it. He was his minister. It was he who ordered the bombardment of Ecuador and so forth. So he's no easy man. He's not very peaceful. But he is of a very ancient origin, bourgeois family, and has understood that the country can't go ahead in these conditions. Many times he has said, and other people also have said, that Colombia could overtake Argentina as the second most important country in South America, but the war doesn't allow it. So he got in an agreement with the FARC to start these talks, which were 3 years secret and then they became public. But not everybody, not even in his government, agrees with that position. Now, the bourgeois interests are very much divided because there are many people who profit from the war. Having been the Minister of Defense or War of Uribe, and now the worst enemy that Santos has is Uribe. So that means that the bourgeoisie is fractured. They don't have, as in other moments they have had, they don't have a united front against progress. There is a section of the bourgeoisie which understands that they have to go through the political understanding with the better forces of the bourgeoisie to make peace and to make a livable country. Now, if you have a position, which there are some in the progressive camp, no, you can't talk with the bourgeois. Well, okay, let's go to war again. Because Fidel Castro, that's what many people don't talk about. Fidel Castro got a sector of the Cuban bourgeoisie to align, not to be with him, but to align with him in order to fight Batista. And you can see that in the first governments of the revolution. Later on, many betrayed the revolution, others became counter-revolutionaries. Okay, but what was the task at the moment? To throw Batista out of power. Now, what's the task in Colombia today? Get peace. Policy is an art. Political science studies policy, but making policy is an art. And not by studying Picasso, you become a great painter.
That's absolutely true. Usually, what happens in Latin America has something or a lot to do with what's been going on in the U.S. And not in the present moment, but with what has been going on for years. How much do you think right now is influencing what's going on in the U.S., in Latin America? Can we expect that something worse than what we have now happens with Trump?
The United States was centered in Latin America until World War II. In World War II, the situation changed dramatically because European imperialists were so hampered by their own fights during the war that they lost almost all strength. And the United States became the power that was going to dictate the rules in what they call the free world. And the European imperialists, in what was rest of their imperialism, they had to go by the rules of the United States. All the American presidents afterwards, even the so-called good ones like Carter, they wanted to defend American imperialism their interests in this way or in that way, but defend them. Now, from my point of view, Mr. Trump is in this position. He has found that the United States has lost much influence in the world. In first place, because the US economy, which in one moment in the 40s was 60% of the capitalist economy in the world, is not in that position now. It's less than a quarter today. And Mr. Trump, it seems, when it said America first, or make America great again, he wants to not be aware of the interests of the rest of the capitalist world. That's why he has had differences with the Europeans. And that is good and bad, because he will do anything to make America great again or first again. But at the same time, his influence in the rest of the world might become minor, because he's damaging interests of his former allies. Who is, maybe in the world, but above all in Latin America, who's the best ally of the United States in Latin America? Mexico. And he's hampering Mexican interests. He's putting in a difficult position his best ally. And I believe that Mr. Trump, in order to achieve the interests he has in the United States, above all the economical interests, is willing to take any risk with any ally outside the American frontiers. And I believe that is a danger for him and for Latin America, but also a possibility. Also a possibility. That influences the election in Mexico. And if it's used in the right way, it may help unwillingly for Mr. Trump, but it may help the best forces, the progressive forces, to win the election.
Thank you so much, professors. It's been tremendously interesting to listen to you, and I'm sure in the next months it will be interesting to talk again about all of these topics which are constantly changing.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you again.